They did not find India divided, they left it that way. Shashi Tharoor, Inglorious Empire. Before the British ever set foot on Indian soil, the subcontinent was diverse, complex, and often politically fragmented. But it was not fractured in the way it later became under colonial rule. Under the guise of modern governance, the British turned diversity into division, sowing the seeds of religious, ethnic, caste, and linguistic conflict that continue to destabilize the region even today. Welcome to Voices from the Colonized, where we dig deep into the buried truths of empire. If you care about untold history, justice, and reclaiming narratives stolen by colonizers, hit like, share, and subscribe. You can also help us financially. Links are in the description below. This is the story of how the British Raj used divide and rule as a masterstroke of control, strategically manipulating identities, inflaming divisions, and fracturing a nation that once dreamed of unity, the myth of a perpetually divided India. For centuries, India was a vibrant blend of peoples and cultures. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists, Christians, Jews, and others lived across the subcontinent. The Mughal Empire, while Islamic in leadership, employed Hindu generals, married Rajput princesses, and collected taxes from all equally. Local courts in South India issued legal rulings referencing both Hindu Dharma and Islamic Sharia, depending on the litigants. Cultural synthesis was everywhere from Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb in the north to shared Sufi and Bhakti traditions across rural villages. Religious identities certainly existed, but they were fluid, overlapping, and often cooperative. It wasn't a utopia, but neither was it the communal powder keg British historians later portrayed. The empire didn't merely exploit India's diversity. It actively deepened and redefined it to ensure a permanently fractured society easier to dominate. 57. A united revolt that shook the empire. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny or the First War of Independence, terrified the British not only because of its scale, but because of its unity. Hindus and Muslims fought together, soldiers revolted, Rajas, Nawabs, and commoners alike rose against the British East India Company. Cities like Delhi, Kanpur, and Lucknow became centers of resistance. Bahadur Shah Zafar, a Mughal emperor in name only at the time, was proclaimed the symbolic leader of a united uprising. The rebellion was ultimately crushed with brutal force. Villages were burned, rebels executed en masse, and families slaughtered. But the British learned something more important than battlefield tactics. They realized that a united Indian population was their greatest threat. From this moment onward, divide and rule became formal policy, not just strategy. Institutionalizing division. In the decades following 1857, British colonial administrators set out to reshape Indian society. Rather than ruling with open violence, they turned to tools of classification, bureaucracy, and identity politics. Religious census and the freezing of identity. In 1871, the British launched the first All-India census. It was not just a head count, it was a categorization exercise. People who had fluid, multiple identities were now boxed into rigid categories: Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, tribal, Buddhist, Jain. British anthropologists and civil servants took these labels and defined them as mutually exclusive and hierarchical. Communities that had previously worshipped local deities while attending Friday prayers or participating in both Holi and Muharram were now forced to pick a side. These artificial boundaries didn't reflect how people saw themselves, but once imposed, they began to reshape self-perception. Identity hardened. Suddenly, you weren't just a villager or farmer, you were a Hindu or a Muslim first. Colonial reports even began exaggerating communal differences, suggesting India had always been a land of eternal religious hostility. Communal electorates and political apartheid. In 1909, the British introduced the Morley-Minto reforms, creating separate electorates for Muslims. This meant Muslims could only vote for Muslim candidates, and the same principle would later apply to Sikhs, Christians, and eventually Dalits under the 1932 Communal Award. While the reforms were presented as a form of political empowerment, in truth they laid the groundwork for political apartheid. They prevented cross-community alliances, ensured fractured political representation, and solidified religious difference as the basis for political identity. The Indian National Congress, though flawed, opposed this tooth and nail. Leaders like Tilak, Gandhi, and Nehru understood what was at stake. They feared that this separation would make nation-building impossible. The British, of course, knew that was precisely the point. Inventing histories of hate. Colonial historians didn't just document history, they rewrote it. Textbooks in British-run schools began to portray the medieval period as one long Hindu-Muslim war. The Mughals were painted as barbaric foreign invaders. Hindu kingdoms were shown as constantly crushed, victimized, and divided until the British came to civilize the land. This selective history ignored the fact that Hindu and Muslim rulers had frequently allied, intermarried, and fought together or against each other based on politics, not religion. The new narrative was one of inevitable religious hatred, turning neighbors into adversaries in the minds of students across the empire. Divide and rule in action, the divide and rule strategy wasn't just theoretical. It played out across the map in policy, infrastructure, and blood. The Partition of Bengal, 1905. In 1905, the British partitioned Bengal into a Hindu-majority west and a Muslim-majority east. They claimed this was for administrative efficiency, but the real reason was to undercut Bengal's increasingly vocal anti-colonial movement. By pitting Hindus and Muslims against each other, the British hoped to stall nationalist unity. The move sparked massive protests, Hindu-Muslim solidarity marches, and eventually the Swadeshi movement. The British reversed the partition in 1911, but the communal divide it created never fully healed. In fact, it foreshadowed the horrors of 1947. Favoritism and fragmentation. The British carefully chose which communities to favor. In the military, for example, they cultivated the idea of martial races, claiming that Sikhs, Gurkhas, Pathans, and Rajputs were natural warriors, while Bengalis and South Indians were effeminate and unfit for combat. This not only entrenched racial stereotypes, but also fostered competition between communities. The same pattern emerged in administration, education, and land ownership. The British would elevate one group to power, then turn to a rival when the first became too politically active. Punjab and the Sikh identity. In Punjab, the British actively encouraged the distinctiveness of Sikh identity as a counterbalance to both Hindus and Muslims. They patronized Sikh religious institutions, recruited heavily from the Sikh population, and emphasized differences between Guru Nanak's teachings and surrounding traditions. By reinforcing the otherness of Sikhs, they aimed to fragment northern India's religious cohesion. Today's communal tensions in Punjab can be traced in part to this deliberate strategy. The final act, partition. By the 1940s, British rule was weakening. World War II had drained the empire, and Indian independence seemed inevitable. But before leaving, the British ensured they would leave behind a broken legacy. The decades of divide and rule politics culminated in the partition of India in 1947, the bloodiest division in modern history. Over 1 million people died in communal massacres. Entire villages were razed. Trains full of refugees arrived at stations filled with corpses. Around 14 million people were displaced. Muslims fled India. Hindus and Sikhs fled Pakistan. Neighborhoods that had once hosted Eid and Diwali side by side became battlefields. Some blamed the Congress, others the Muslim League. But let's be honest, partition was made possible because British policies had prepared the soil for decades. Mountbatten's rushed partition plan and Radcliffe's overnight line drawing were just the final slash in an already bleeding wound. The lingering shadows. Even after independence, the fault lines remained. India and Pakistan remained locked in a hostile rivalry, shaped by partition and colonial mismanagement. Communal riots, like those in Gujarat, 2002 Delhi, 1984 and 2020, and Muzaffarnagar, 2013, still erupt with horrifying regularity. Caste, religion and language politics dominate electoral campaigns, echoing the separate electorates and identity games of the Raj. The colonizer may have gone, but the colonial framework is still alive in how we think, vote, and fear. Resisting the divide, and yet there is resistance. The Khilafat movement of the 1920s brought Hindus and Muslims together in defense of the Ottoman Caliphate. Gandhi's efforts repeatedly emphasized religious harmony and non-violence, even when faced with assassination threats. Revolutionary figures like Bhagat Singh rejected religious divisions and called for unity through socialism and anti-imperialism. Today, new generations across South Asia are reclaiming forgotten solidarity, re-examining distorted histories and challenging the colonial mindset still embedded in our politics and textbooks. Conclusion: the British didn't simply rule India through force. They ruled it through divisions, strategic, cultural, and deeply psychological. By turning Indians against each other, they ensured they could govern with minimal resistance and maximum control. If we want a future free from colonial legacies, we must first understand how they were built. Thank you for watching Voices from the Colonized, where we expose the hidden blueprints of empire. If this story informed or moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep creating content that challenges the narrative. And if you'd like to help us continue this work, you can support us financially. All links are in the description below. Until next time, let's keep amplifying the voices empire tried to silence.